I was 58 when it happened. Up until that point, I had worked tirelessly to build my empire from the ground up. Mark Connors Enterprises, a multi-million-dollar business that spanned everything from logistics to consulting. I had done it all. Long hours, risky decisions, navigating my way through the ups and downs of running a business, and somehow managing to keep the company afloat through some truly stormy waters. It wasn't easy, but I was proud of the empire I had built. My family, my wife Sarah, my two daughters, and son-in-law Eric, had always been a part of it, even if they weren't directly involved in the day-to-day operations. Then, one morning, everything changed. I woke up feeling off, dizzy, weak, with a slight headache. It didn't seem like anything serious at first, but by the time I reached my office that afternoon, it was clear something was wrong. I couldn't focus, and my left arm felt numb. I tried to ignore it, thinking it would pass, but as the day went on, it became impossible to ignore. I went to the doctor the next day, and after a series of tests, I learned that I had suffered a stroke. The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't some old man on the edge of retirement. I was still in my prime. I still had so much to do, so many more plans, and yet here I was facing the harsh reality of a health crisis. The doctors told me I was lucky. It could have been much worse, but as I sat in that sterile hospital room, my mind raced with fear and uncertainty. What would happen to the business, to my family? The recovery process was grueling. I spent months in and out of physical therapy, working hard to regain strength in my body and speech. But during this time, I also noticed a shift in my family dynamics. My wife, Sarah, ever supportive, stood by me without question. But Eric, my son-in-law, had a different attitude. Eric had always been the eager-to-please type. When he married my eldest daughter, Emily, he seemed like a perfect fit, ambitious, charming, and ready to take on the world. He had worked for me in the business for a while, but he wasn't directly involved in any major decisions. At least, that's what I thought. As the months passed after my stroke, however, his behavior began to change. I remember the day it all became clear. My daughter Emily and I were having lunch in my office, one of the few places where I could still get some work done. I had been recovering well enough to get back into the routine, albeit at a slower pace. As we were talking, Eric barged in with a forced smile, looking somewhat awkward but determined. He walked over to my desk and, without asking, sat down, leaning in to look at some of the paperwork I had left out. "Hey, Dad," he said, using that nickname he had started calling me ever since he and Emily got married. "How's the business holding up? You think it's time to bring in some new people for management positions? Maybe even think about restructuring the board?" I paused for a moment, surprised at the question. Eric had never shown an interest in such matters before. He had always been more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, content with his small role in the company. But now, with my health hanging in the balance, he seemed eager, almost too eager. It was a question that didn't sit right with me. "Eric, what are you getting at?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. His smile faltered for a split second, but then he recovered. "Nothing, just trying to help. I'm just thinking ahead, you know? We've been through a lot as a family, and it might be time to make some big changes. Maybe even put me in a higher position to take some of the load off your shoulders." His words sounded innocent enough, but the tone, it wasn't right. There was something in the way he said it, something behind his words that made me uncomfortable. I had always trusted Eric, but this felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I knew something wasn't right. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more red flags. Eric began to get involved in meetings that had previously been outside his scope. He'd pop into my office at odd hours, asking about finances, company projections, and even some of the more delicate business relationships I had. And then, one evening, I found him going through some of the business records in the safe, which was odd because he had no reason to be in there without my permission. I could feel it. He was planning something. I just didn't know what yet. But it wasn't until the family dinner a few weeks later that the true scope of Eric's betrayal began to unfold. It was a quiet evening, nothing unusual. My health had improved somewhat, though I was still far from 100%. We were all sitting around the dinner table at Sarah's place, chatting about life and family, when Eric, in front of everyone, made a chilling remark. "Mark," he said, not even looking at me, "hope you die after that stroke. It'd make everything a lot easier for all of us, don't you think?" His words hung in the air like a slap to the face. The room went silent. I felt the blood rush to my head, but I didn't react right away. Instead, I simply sat there, staring at him, my mind racing. My daughter Emily, shocked, was the first to speak up. "Eric, what the hell did you just say?" she exclaimed. But Eric, ever the manipulator, just shrugged it off. "I was just kidding," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Mark's tough. He'll pull through. Right, Dad?" The smug grin on his face was all I needed to see. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't joking. He meant what he had said. The mask had slipped, and for the first time, I realized how deep his ambitions went. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It wasn't just about me being weak. It was about power. It was about control. And at that moment, I knew that whatever I had built, whatever I had worked for, was now at risk of being stolen away from me by someone I had trusted with everything. But I wasn't done yet. I would not let him have it. I would not let him take everything from me without a fight. I may have been weak physically, but my mind was sharp, and I was prepared to protect everything I had worked for, even if it meant going head-to-head with my own family. As the weeks passed, I began to settle into my new routine, adjusting to life after the stroke. My recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy, speech therapy, daily exercises, and despite everything, I was determined to get back to business. However, there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something didn't feel right. The stroke had left me physically vulnerable, but mentally, I was sharper than ever. It started with the small things, little behaviors that I had previously overlooked, attributing them to normal work stress, or Eric's ambitious nature. But as I spent more time at the office trying to get back into the swing of things, I noticed things that didn't add up. Eric's interest in the business was becoming obsessive. He'd come into my office at odd times, even when I hadn't scheduled a meeting. He'd ask about the company's investments, particularly the ones that had been relatively dormant for the past few years. He wanted to know the details of our assets, every asset, and started to pepper me with questions I hadn't expected him to ask. "How much do we have in reserves?" he'd ask one day. "Do we have any outstanding debts we haven't addressed yet?" he would ask on another. And most concerning of all, "Have you thought about restructuring the company for better efficiency? Maybe streamline some of the teams and make it more profitable?" At first, it didn't raise any alarms. I had always valued Eric's enthusiasm. He was my son-in-law, after all, and I wanted him to succeed. But as his questions became more detailed and his presence in the office more frequent, my initial sense of unease began to grow. What struck me as odd was his sudden involvement in matters that had never been part of his role before. Before my stroke, Eric had only handled a small portion of the business, mostly client relations and some marketing efforts. Nothing substantial, but now he was showing up in meetings with the finance team, sitting in on confidential strategy sessions, and asking for reports on investments and business deals that were far outside the scope of his job description. I didn't have time to confront him directly, so I started watching from the sidelines. Something didn't sit right, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. It could just be that Eric was eager to help, eager to prove himself after I had fallen ill. After all, he had been married to my daughter for years now, and I had always seen him as part of the family, trusted with the future of the company. But then came the real wake-up call. It happened one night when I was working late in my office. I had recently returned from a physical therapy session, feeling more worn out than usual, but I was determined to keep working on some financial projections. The office was quiet, the lights dim, as I flipped through some old reports on our investments and company holdings. Something caught my eye, an odd transaction on one of the accounts. It wasn't large, but it was out of place. I decided to look deeper. I pulled up more records, scrolling through them carefully. The transactions I was reviewing were from months ago, but they had gone unnoticed by our accountants at the time. A couple of large withdrawals and wire transfers, moving money from one of our international accounts into another account under a different name. The name didn't ring a bell. It wasn't one of our usual contacts. I felt my pulse quicken as I dug deeper. More transactions, more oddities. The numbers didn't add up. Someone had been siphoning funds from the business, and that someone was close enough to access the accounts without arousing suspicion. It was then that I remembered the times Eric had asked about the company's reserves and debts. It all clicked into place. It wasn't just curiosity. He had been testing the waters, seeing how much he could manipulate, seeing what I wouldn't notice. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Eric was involved. I couldn't believe it. How had I missed it? How had I been so blind? Here was my son-in-law, the man who had been welcomed into our family, trusted with everything, and now he was bleeding the company dry. I immediately reached out to my lawyer, Greg, who had been handling my business matters for years. I didn't want to panic yet, but I needed to get to the bottom of this. We began reviewing the financial records together, digging through everything. The more we found, the worse it got. Eric had been actively involved in pushing through shady financial decisions, manipulating records, and even forging signatures on some documents. The more I discovered, the more I realized this wasn't just about the money. Eric had been planning something bigger, something darker. He wasn't just interested in the business. He was plotting to take over the entire empire. But there was something even more disturbing. As Greg and I dug through the records, we discovered that some of the accounts Eric had been siphoning funds into were linked to offshore entities with questionable origins. This wasn't just theft. This was financial fraud, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. Eric had crossed the line. He hadn't just taken a few dollars here and there. He had been systematically stealing, all while hiding in plain sight as the loving, loyal son-in-law. And now, with me recovering from a stroke, he was using my vulnerability to his advantage. The question now was, how far had he gone? How much damage had been done? And most importantly, what was I going to do about it? The shock of realizing that Eric was siphoning funds from the business still hadn't fully settled in. I had suspected something was off, but the full weight of his betrayal didn't hit me until I began looking through the financial records with Greg. What I found was far worse than I ever imagined. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I was still recovering from the stroke, and every day felt like a battle, but I had to take action, swiftly and decisively. The longer I waited, the more damage Eric would be able to do. It wasn't just a few questionable transactions. It was a calculated and systematic approach to stripping the company of its wealth, all while pretending to be a loyal family member. One day, while I was still recovering at home, I got a call from Greg. His voice was grim. "Mark, I've been going over everything, and it's worse than we thought. Eric has forged your signature on several key financial agreements. I believe he's already begun moving assets out of the company's hands and into his own." I felt a chill run through me. A part of me had hoped I was wrong, but now I knew Eric was taking everything he could, and my stroke had made it all too easy for him. The first major breach happened when Eric managed to convince one of our senior business partners to sign off on a contract. He did it under the guise of helping streamline the company's operations, claiming that he was just trying to take some of the weight off my shoulders while I recovered. What they didn't realize was that Eric had already lined up a deal with a competitor that would siphon millions from our business. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about taking control of everything. Eric had clearly been laying the groundwork for months, planning, manipulating, and waiting for the right moment. His behavior around the office had changed. He was no longer the son-in-law who casually dropped by for dinner or stayed late helping out when needed. Now, he was the man who spoke with authority, who bypassed me to talk to the executives directly, and who asked for regular access to confidential information. But the most devastating blow came when Greg uncovered Eric's final play. Eric had begun working with a third party, an outside investor with a known reputation for taking over failing businesses. The deal had already been set in motion, and the money was flowing in Eric's direction. The paperwork was in order. Everything had been executed behind my back. It was a hostile takeover in the truest sense. Eric had been preparing for this moment for months, feeding information to the investor, directing the flow of money, and even using my own stroke to make it all happen without resistance. He'd made sure to manipulate key individuals in the company, cutting me out of the loop at every turn. I couldn't believe it. My own son-in-law had orchestrated the systematic theft of my family's legacy. The betrayal stung even more because Eric knew how important the business was to me, not just as a source of income, but as a symbol of everything I had worked for. My family's future was tied to it. My reputation was built on it, and here was Eric, tearing it all down for his own gain. I tried to process it, but I could feel my blood boiling. I had worked for decades to build something that would last, something that my children and eventually their children could be proud of. And now, Eric was dismantling it piece by piece, all while pretending to care for me, all while standing by my side as my trusted ally. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could he do this? What had happened to the man I had trusted, the man who had stood at my side during family dinners and business events, the man who had pledged his loyalty to me and my family? I had no choice now. I needed to take control back. Eric's actions had gone too far, and he had crossed a line I could never allow him to return from. The business was my life's work, and I wasn't going to let him steal it out from under me without a fight. Greg and I put a plan into motion. We began gathering every piece of evidence we could find, every forged document, every shady transaction, every email that proved Eric had been manipulating the situation. I knew that confronting him directly would be risky. Eric wasn't someone who would back down easily. He had played this game for far too long, but I was determined to make sure that he paid for what he had done. I took a deep breath and steeled myself for the confrontation that was coming. Eric had been careful, but I knew enough about him now to know that his arrogance would be his downfall. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought I was too weak to fight back. But the truth was, he had underestimated me. The moment I had discovered what he had done, I had already started planning my next move, and when the time came, I would make sure that Eric's theft didn't just end with him walking away. No, I would ensure that the truth came out, that he was held accountable for every single action he took in his quest for power. The family business would not fall into his hands, not now, not ever. But I had one more step to take before confronting him. I needed to find the final proof, the undeniable evidence that would tie him to everything. And when I had it, I would make sure he paid the price. It had been a long few weeks since I first realized how deep Eric's betrayal ran. The more I looked into the situation, the more sinister it all seemed. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, unsure who I could trust, unsure of who was still loyal to me and the family business. My head was spinning, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I couldn't do this alone. As soon as I realized how bad things were, I called in Greg, my longtime lawyer, and someone I knew I could trust without question. Greg and I had been through countless business deals together. He knew the ins and outs of the company better than anyone, and his expertise was what I needed to get through this. We began poring over every document, every transaction, every email, and every phone call connected to Eric. Greg was relentless. He sifted through financial statements, cross-referenced accounts, and scrutinized paperwork that I had never thought to look at so carefully before. It was a grueling process, but I could feel the tension in the air. We were closing in on something, and I knew we couldn't back down now. One evening, a breakthrough came. I was sitting at my desk in the study, my eyes straining in the dim light of the computer screen. I had pulled up a stack of financial records that I had managed to get my hands on from our company's internal systems. I had been told that everything was in order, that the accounts had been reconciled, and that there were no discrepancies. But I had always trusted my gut, and it told me something wasn't right. As I clicked through the records, something caught my eye. There was a large sum of money that had been transferred to an unknown account. The transaction was marked under Eric's name, but the details were fuzzy. The account number looked unfamiliar, and the recipient had no connection to our business whatsoever. It didn't make sense. I immediately called Greg into the room. "Look at this," I said, pointing at the screen. Greg examined it closely, and his face grew pale. "Mark, this is big. This isn't just a small theft. This is something far more complex than we thought." We went over the numbers again, and everything started to fall into place. Eric had been transferring millions of dollars out of the company in small increments, hiding them in accounts under his control. Each transfer was carefully timed, making it appear as if the business was simply paying off operational costs or making investments. But when we cross-checked these transactions with the actual financial reports, it became clear that they didn't match up. The accounts he was funneling money into were all linked to offshore holdings, companies that didn't exist in any official records. The deeper we dug, the more we found. Eric had created a network of fake accounts and shell companies, all designed to hide the stolen money and make it nearly impossible to trace. He had also been manipulating invoices and creating false reports to make it seem as though everything was legitimate. Greg and I sat in stunned silence as we pieced it together. Eric had been using the business's own resources to fund his personal scheme. He'd had help from others, but the mastermind behind it all was him. This wasn't just embezzlement, it was grand theft, fraud, and conspiracy. And the worst part was that Eric had planned this out for months, perhaps even longer. He had been working behind my back for years, setting the stage to steal everything I had built, all while pretending to be the dutiful son-in-law who was just looking out for me. We continued our search, trying to find every last piece of evidence that could link Eric to this elaborate fraud. Greg used every legal resource he had to track down the identities of people Eric had been working with. It wasn't easy, but we eventually managed to identify some of his accomplices, several high-level individuals who were involved in fraudulent financial schemes, many of whom had ties to the very businesses Eric was trying to bring down. As I stared at the screen, the weight of everything hit me. Eric had been playing me for a fool the entire time. He had used my stroke as the perfect opportunity to carry out his plans without any suspicion. He had manipulated my trust and turned it into a weapon against me. And now, I was left trying to pick up the pieces. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I knew I had to act quickly before he could cover his tracks any further. Greg and I put together a strategy to expose Eric's fraudulent activities. We gathered the evidence we had, and we were ready to make our move. This wasn't just a fight for money. It was a fight for my reputation, my legacy, and the future of my family. I had spent my life building this business, and no matter how hard Eric tried, I wasn't going to let him destroy it. The time had finally come. I had all the evidence I needed, and I knew it was time to confront Eric. I'd been waiting for this moment for weeks, no, for months. Ever since I first realized he was playing me, every part of my body screamed for justice. I wanted to end this deception once and for all, and I knew exactly where to do it. I had a safe in my office, a place where I kept confidential business documents, legal contracts, and other sensitive materials. The safe had always been a secure part of my office, something that only a few trusted individuals knew the combination to. It was my last line of defense, and what made it even more significant now was the fact that I'd placed the most important pieces of evidence in there. Documents proving Eric's involvement in the fraudulent transfers, the forged signatures, and everything that tied him to his criminal activities were all locked away in that safe. The plan was simple. I would call him into my office, let him think it was just another routine meeting about the business. Eric, being as cocky as he always was, would never have suspected what was coming. He thought he'd already won, that he'd gotten away with everything. But I had one last move left. It was late afternoon when I called him. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my face neutral. I could already hear the shuffle of Eric's footsteps as he approached my office. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and sat down at my desk, looking over the files in front of me. I knew this was going to be the most intense moment of my life, but I was ready. Eric walked in, looking smug as usual. He was trying to act casual, but I could see the slight tension in his body. He had no idea that everything was about to come crashing down around him. "Hey, Mark," he said, with that fake warmth in his voice. "What's up?" "Just wanted to go over a few things," I replied, not wasting any time. "Sit down. I'll get right to the point." I gestured for him to sit across from me. He did, crossing his legs and leaning back in the chair, looking almost too comfortable. The whole time, I could tell he had no idea that I knew everything. He thought he was still in control, and that made this moment all the more satisfying for me. "Eric, I've been looking over some things lately. Some things I think you need to explain to me," I said, my voice calm but firm. He raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean? I haven't done anything wrong." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stood up and walked to the safe behind my desk. I could feel Eric's eyes on me, but I didn't let him see the smile creeping up at the corners of my lips. This was it. I slowly dialed the combination, feeling the weight of the moment as I unlocked it. When the safe door clicked open, Eric's eyes flicked to the contents inside, documents, folders, and files. I could tell his mind was racing, but he didn't know which files held the proof of his deceit. I pulled out a file and tossed it on the desk in front of him. The folder was thick, bulging with paperwork. His eyes narrowed as he flipped it open, but when he saw the financial records, his face went pale. The fraud, the transfers, the forged signatures, all the evidence I'd been collecting for weeks was laid out in front of him in black and white. Eric's hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages, his face flushing with a mix of panic and disbelief. I could see the realization hitting him that he was caught. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. He was trying to gather himself, but he couldn't. For the first time since I'd known him, I could see fear in his eyes. "Mark, I didn't..." His voice faltered, but he was trying to hold on to the last shred of control. I could hear his heartbeat racing, and I almost felt sorry for him, but not enough to show any mercy. I leaned forward, my hands on the desk, staring at him with a calm intensity. "You didn't think I would find out, did you, Eric?" I said quietly. "You thought I was weak. that I was just a stroke victim who couldn't protect his own family or business. But I've known for a while now. You've been stealing from me, from my company, and from the family. Eric's fingers went to the edges of the paper, as if he were trying to push it away. But I could see the panic taking over him. He couldn't deny it. The truth was right there, in front of him, with no escape. I straightened up, taking a deep breath, and said the words that would forever change the course of everything. Good luck in your new position. His face went white, and I could see the weight of the moment crushing him. He was done. The man who thought he had it all figured out, the one who'd been using my own family against me, was now trapped in his own lies. I didn't need to raise my voice or shout. I simply watched as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. Eric stood up abruptly, knocking the chair behind him. He was sweating now, his hands shaking, but he didn't dare try to run. There was nowhere left for him to go. "This isn't over, Mark. You'll regret this," he spat, his voice shaking with anger and fear. But I didn't flinch. I didn't let his threats bother me. "No, Eric," I said, my voice steady. "It's over, and it's you who'll regret it." He turned and stormed out of my office, leaving me standing there, knowing that I had finally taken control back. The game was over. With Eric out of the picture, I quickly regained control of the business. His fraudulent actions were exposed, and I took the necessary legal steps to protect everything I had built. The weight was lifted off my shoulders. I handed the business over to Claire. She was ready to lead, and I knew the empire was in good hands. I sold the office, moved to a quiet ranch, and finally found peace. My legacy was secure. The future of the business and my family was stronger than ever.